Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art, with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is The Anxiety of Absurdity, Art's Sisyphean Task. And Sisyphus climbed on his rock to listen. Ovid, Metamorphoses. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Albert Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus. Hi everybody, and as you can see, we're going to be looking at the concept of anxiety through the prism of absurdity this time. So the next few videos, or a lot of them, are going to be on the concept of anxiety from different perspectives. And Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus is fascinating because it adopts, building on the last video, it adopts a very philosophical attitude to absurdity. So I'll be distinguishing between the dictionary definition of absurdity and the more philosophical definition that Camus gives. And it took me quite a while to put this together because I was struggling to work out how to give full justice to Camus' philosophical insights, but without just providing quotation after quotation and having to dive really deep into the Myth of Sisyphus, the text. And I found Rodin, the sculptor, was very helpful in helping me focus my ideas on how to give more artistic illustrations. So I'll be giving you some painting illustrations and some sculpture. And I don't think on this channel I've done full justice to sculpture. So Rodin will be figured, and also Alberto Giacometti, who was Swiss. I think the name sounds Italian, but I'm pretty sure he was Swiss. And he was a collaborator with Samuel Beckett, provided the very stark scenery for Waiting for Godot, which I'll dive into. So without more ado, this idea of Sisyphus, the pointlessness, perhaps, of life, and how that could create various forms of anxiety. And I'm hoping that when you dive deeper into it, Camus is actually quite life-affirming and quite positive, and could be interpreted negatively and miserably, but I'm going to argue for a more positive interpretation, so I hope you enjoy. And here's quite a contemporary modern representation of the whole idea, the myth of Sisyphus. And the idea was, I won't go into, I'm going to mention various myths today, and I'm just going to give you a very brief, the relevance of them, but I encourage you to go off and read the full stories, because the problem with myths are, they, like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, they just constantly relate to each other, and when you begin to tell the background to one myth, you have to start giving more and more information. So the absolute bare bones of Sisyphus is he's punished, sent down to hell, and he's given this pointless task of pushing a boulder up a hill, and just as it gets to the top, the gods make it roll back down again. And Camus takes this idea in a text called The Myth of Sisyphus, which I've included a link to the full text in the description. I think it's the University of Hawaii provides a PDF. And the Myth of Sisyphus is only the last few pages. It's various sections. I think the first 3 or 4 sections all relate to the concept of absurdity. And then he finishes it off with a brief discussion of the Myth of Sisyphus. So I'll be going through various parts of the complete text, and like I said before, trying to illustrate it with appropriate artistic references. So this is a painting by Serge Mazet, and I tend to, I'm an old fogey, so whenever I get the opportunity to use a more modern piece, 2016 is quite recent. And here's old Albert, a bit more photogenic than Sartre, without being too lookist about the whole thing. And obviously he wouldn't be a French philosopher without a giton in his mouth. And I think this photograph was by Henri Cartier-Bresson. And I'm always a bit cynical about how good you have to be a photographer, but I must admit, this particular photograph screams French philosopher, trendy French philosopher, the James Dean. And considering he died a tragic and quite absurd death, sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but given that the concept today is a lot about absurdity, I think he was with his editor, Gallimard, who's the Gallimard publishing house is still famous in France. And he had a train ticket to go home to Paris, and him and his editor friend had been drinking all day, and Gallimard offered to give him a lift home, and the car crashed and killed both of them, I think, but definitely Camus. So he died, as you can see, only 47 years old, which is only the good die young, as they say. And the Myth of Sisyphus was 1942. I think the first English translation was 1955. But anyway. So the basic, this is, you can get, different dictionary definitions, obviously, but this brief definition of the absurd. So it's an adjective, utterly or obviously senseless, illogical or untrue, contrary to all reason or common sense, laughably foolish or false. An absurd explanation is an example. So that's just the basic definition, but I hasten to add Camus is using the term differently. He's using it from an unashamedly philosophical perspective. So I'm going to give you some tasters of how Camus couched the whole idea. So man feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. The realization that life is absurd cannot be an end, but only a beginning. So I did say at the beginning, I think Camus has a relatively positive interpretation of the absurd. But right from the get-go, and throughout the Myth of Sisyphus, the whole text that is, not just the specific section, he emphasizes the confrontation. And in a future video, I'm going to look at, there's a philosopher, Thomas Nagel, who's a philosopher of the mind and consciousness, and he disagrees with Camus. So Camus is suggesting there's a confrontation between us as human beings and the worldly environment we find ourselves in that basically doesn't listen to us. It's, what's the phrase there? The unreasonable silence of the world, which is a brilliant, just this mute. I think later on there's a quotation that talks about the density of reality, but it's not exactly, you can't talk unless you're King Lear on the heath railing at the nature. You can't engage with the world that we inhabit, and that causes a lot of frustration. Whereas Nagel, this other philosopher, he suggests that he identifies the confrontation from within people themselves. So he argues we have this innate ability to understand the world in what he calls, or philosophers call, a transcendental sense. We tend to think in abstract terms as human beings, but we're also thrust into the world. And there's this constant tension. So it's not particularly relevant now, but it is a theme I'll develop in future, this idea that does the fault lie within us, to paraphrase Shakespeare, or is it our position in the world that we're thrown into and it's not our fault? And that would be Camus' position. But in either case, there's this feeling of absurdity. They just, Nagel and Camus differ over the specific implications sometimes. But anyway, that's for another day. So this is the opening gambit, what Camus means by the concept of the absurd. And then I'm giving you some more. These aren't from, I just need to hasten to emphasize, these aren't from Camus himself, but it's quite a funny, not funny, but it's quite an imaginative book, this introducing the existentialists, and it's imaginary interviews. So this Solomon author, he does some pretend interviews and writes them up. So he does an interview with Heidegger that's quite funny, because he includes some of the dialogue, and he implies that Heidegger's basically a pompous Teutonic tosspot, and he pretends he interviews him in a coffee shop. But the interview with Camus provides the following quotations, and I include them because although it's a fictitious interview, Solomon is trying to present the ideas a bit more clearly than just in pure philosophical form. So he presents it as a dialogue. And while he's asking Camus questions, this is one of the responses he gets about what is the absurd. So this is Camus, and it's based, this is quite accurate to what Camus actually wrote about, and you'll see echoes of what's said here, which is imaginary, but in the actual Myth of Sisyphus itself. So this is Camus purportedly speaking via Solomon channeling him. I believe that love of life is the highest virtue, and life is absurd in the sense that we cannot comprehend it, find its purpose, its meaning. And so we revolt against that absurdity, create meanings in the face of the absurd, not denying it, but confronting it, keeping it alive, to use up everything that we are given, to assert our will to live without hope or meaning. That is happiness. And I'll be coming back to the concept of happiness. I remember at the beginning the quote, one must imagine Sisyphus is happy. So just keep the notion of happiness in mind. Absurd events do not constitute the absurd. The absurd is the stupid density of the world, a density we attempt to illuminate with metaphors and illusions. A world understood with bad reasons is still familiar to us. A world explained by appeal to God or justice or capitalism, for example, is a world in which one can resign oneself to apparent absurdity, denying the absurd. It is against such hopes and resignation that I insist on revolting. So just to re-emphasize that this isn't what Camus actually said, but I'd argue it's quite an accurate summary. And the key things to pick out here. So this notion of happiness earlier on, the quotation, one must imagine Sisyphus to be happy, they are the very last words of the whole text of the Myth of Sisyphus. And it's linked to this concept of what Camus argues is the key essential human quality we should strive for. He distinguishes, as you can see in the second paragraph there, between resignation and revolt. So Camus also wrote a book called The Rebel, and it's a theme that runs through his work. It's about not taking the absurdity we find ourselves in, rebelling against it, never denying that it's absurd, but just not resigning, this notion of resignation. And in Camus' mind, resignation is when we create an ideology, whether it's religion, whether it's Marxist politics, an all-encompassing explanation that purports to explain everything. And later I'll also say I think science falls into that trap because it thinks it can explain absolutely everything. So explanations that seek to explain what Camus, and I would also agree with him, things that are comprehension of life is ultimately unexplainable. That's part of the human condition. And rather than resign yourself by creating false narratives, false unities, Camus is arguing that we should rebel against that. And I should have said at the beginning that if you're of a religious mindset, please just bear with me and I'll trace how Camus, from a completely atheistic point of view, talks about meaning in life. In future, I'm going to look at Kierkegaard, and I would argue that Kierkegaard and Camus, despite the fact in The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus mentions a few times Kierkegaard in opposition. He's basically saying Kierkegaard's wrong because Kierkegaard is providing a religious explanation to the human condition, and Camus rejects that. But there's a strong argument to say that Kierkegaard doesn't provide any easy answers. That's the understatement of the millennium. Kierkegaard's really difficult. And yes, Kierkegaard argues for religious faith at the end of the day, and he talks about a leap into the darkness. But there's actually some quite interesting parallels between Camus and Kierkegaard. So, like I say, if you can bear with me and treat this, if you are religious and don't like the atheistic slant of Camus, please, it's worth you watching the rest so that when I look at someone like Kierkegaard, who is religious, you can actually see some of the similarities. But anyway, I've emphasized and italicized this phrase in the second paragraph, The absurd is the stupid density of the world, a density that we attempt to illuminate with metaphors and delusions. And that's a crucial element of why later on Camus argues for the importance of creativity in the human condition, and by extension art. And that is part of what fuels the revolt against absurdity. It's acceptance, but also our revolt of it. So while you accept that we are bound to live an absurd life, you constantly revolt against it nevertheless. What you don't do is just give in and resign, which you can see there. It's against such hopes and resignation that I insist on revolting. And I quite like this definition he offers quite early on. It's absurd means it's impossible, but also it's contradictory. And this is the explanation I really like. If I see a man armed with only a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider his act to be absurd. But it is so solely by the virtue of the disproportion between his intention and the reality he will encounter, of the contradiction I notice between his true strength and the aim he has in view. So another example of this would be, let's say a very powerful person, the president or a prime minister, is giving a speech and his trousers fell down. The example, it's the contrast between the importance or the self-perception of importance and the ridiculous sight of someone being embarrassed. Or in this case, he's talking about the contrast, the disproportion between the intention. So this guy's running a machine guns with just a sword. It's the contrast between the intention, what you want to do, and the reality that faces you. So I always like, there's a quote from a guy called Herbert Marcuse, who was a critical theorist, and he was talking about trying to resist political systems that are dominant. And he has this beautiful phrase, I'm paraphrasing from memory, but I think it's quite accurate. He says, the unrealistic sound of these propositions is indicative not of their utopian nature, but of the forces arrayed against them. So what he's saying is, when it's difficult to change something, it doesn't mean that you're wrong. It doesn't mean that it is an oppressive system. It's just that the system you're trying to fight is so strong, it makes your attempts to rectify it look ridiculous. And I think that's not a bad way to understand what Camus means when he's talking about absurdity. You as a person may not be doing anything absurd. The examples he gives are, but the human condition, according to Camus, is such that just by trying to live a human life, you're bound to be thrust into a position of absurdity because of the strength of the forces arrayed against you, to put it in Marcuse's terms. But anyway, he continues, the feeling of absurdity does not spring from the mere scrutiny of a fact or an impression, but that it bursts from the comparison between a bare fact and a certain reality, between an action and the world that transcends it. The absurd is essentially a divorce. It lies in neither of the elements compared. It is born of their confrontation. So again, it's this idea that it's almost, without getting too technical, Hegelian, this idea of a dialectic, but it's about the confrontation of us and the environment we find ourselves in, and it's inevitable because this idea that it's almost like the cruel indifference of the world. It doesn't listen to us. And no matter what we try, you're ultimately going to fail because, well, for starters, we're all mortal beings. We're going to die, just to be cheery. So failure's baked into the whole project. And then no matter how hard you try to lead a good life, to be successful, all these things you can try to do, you don't control just the contingency, the randomness, the arbitrary nature of some of the things that could happen to you. And it's the confrontation between the two that Camus wants to emphasize. And now this is a quote And I'll explain why in a second, why I'm giving it you again, but I think I used this in the welcome video. And I think he's a brilliant, Michael Oakeshott is a brilliant cultural historian, maybe, might be the best way to describe him. But I just love this paragraph. We are apt to think of civilization as something solid and external, but at bottom it is a collective dream. Insofar as the soul is in the body, says Plotinus, it lies in deep sleep. What a people dreams in this earthly sleep is its civilization, and the substance of this dream is a myth, an imaginative interpretation of human existence, the perception, not the solution, of the mystery of human life. The project of science, as I understand it, is to solve the mystery, to wake us from our dream, to destroy the myth. And were this project fully achieved, not only should we find ourselves awake in a profound darkness, but a dreadful insomnia would settle upon mankind, not less intolerable for being only a nightmare. And why I'm constantly in future videos as well, I'll always throw this paragraph at you, this quotation, because it chimes with so many of the writers I respect, but I've italicized and emboldened this phrase. An imaginative interpretation of human existence, the perception, not the solution, of the mystery of human life. So, I previously said Camus was against resigning ourselves to overly simple explanations or to explanations that claim to answer everything. But I think Oakeshott's with Camus on this idea of an imaginative interpretation of human existence. What I want to show is how Camus ultimately resorts to art and creativity as the thing that keeps us going in our rebellion against the absurdity of existence. And I think this quotation from Oakeshott backs up Camus' idea that if you include science in this attempt to provide an overwhelming, all-encompassing, unifying answer to everything, then you're missing the point of human existence, because its very nature doesn't lend itself to one unified explanation. So why myth and art are important is they're offering help in our revolt, but they're not claiming to offer definitive answers. Whereas most political ideologies, most scientists to some extent, depending how reasonable they are, would say they can offer limited explanations of limited fields of knowledge. But, for example, science isn't the answer to everything. But I just always go back to this quotation from Oakeshott, because he just has this idea of the counterintuitive idea that a dreadful insomnia would settle upon mankind. So this idea of needing sleep, which Camus actually refers to, you'll see in a second, it's got links to loads of things like Plato's cave and all sorts, so I'll resist the temptation to witter on. But I just do love this quotation. So this is Camus again. And this is where he picks up on the idea of sleep. So this is why I'm linking it to the Oakeshott. What then is that incalculable feeling that deprives the mind of the sleep necessary to life? A world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. But, on the other hand, in a universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights, man feels an alien, a stranger. And Camus wrote a novel, L'étranger, the outsider or the stranger. His exile is without remedy, since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home or the hope of a promised land. This divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. So the sleep necessary to life, it goes back to what Oakeshott was talking about in the previous quotation. But then he says a world that can be explained even with bad reasons is a familiar world. So Camus suggesting that some of our explanations that we seek are just to make us feel familiar, make us feel at home, because otherwise we're dominated by the absurd. But implicit in what Camus says through his text, The Myth of Sisyphus, is that just creating familiarity may make us feel better, but it's not the true answer. And actually it's inauthentic if the truth is that we live in an unfamiliar, unhomely, threatening world. We shouldn't kid ourselves, it's different. And it just reminds me, so when he goes on to say, I'm jumping about here, but he says, his exile is without remedy since he is deprived of the memory of a lost home. If you think to one of the very first literary epics of Western culture, the Iliad and the Odyssey, this idea of being away from your homeland and trying to get back, it's one of the archetypes of Western culture. A universe suddenly divested of illusions and lights. So he's talking about, this is when you embrace an absurdity, when you don't hide behind overly easy, safe explanations. Man feels an alien, a stranger. And this is relevant because in a second I'm going to make references to Samuel Beckett. But this divorce between man and his life, the actor and his setting, is properly the feeling of absurdity. So I'm going to claim this, if you want specific examples of what this all means, Samuel Beckett's work, I think, explores this. And I mentioned science before because I always have a bee in my bonnet about people over-relying upon scientific explanations. But in this little section, Camus differentiates explicitly between method, and this is what really gets me when people don't accept that when they claim to have objective knowledge about any given situation, they can only have the knowledge that the method they've chosen to obtain that knowledge allows them to get. And I've forgotten who said the phrase, but basically a scientist who doesn't like metaphysics just means the scientist doesn't like you questioning his metaphysics. In other words, there are methods, we all have underlying assumptions and suppositions, even though we think we may be adopting neutral, objective methods. And art, arguably, because it's upfront and honest, that it doesn't have all the answers, and it's got limited methods, arguably art is why I think Camus makes this distinction. So without more ado, method is one of analysis and not of knowledge. For methods imply metaphysics. Unconsciously, they disclose conclusions that they often claim not to know yet. Similarly, the last pages of a book are already contained in the first pages. Such a link is inevitable. The method defined here acknowledges the feeling that all true knowledge is impossible. Solely appearances can be enumerated, and the climate make itself felt. Perhaps we shall be able to overtake that elusive feeling of absurdity in the different but closely related worlds of intelligence, of the art of living, or of art itself. And I just love this. I've emboldened and emphasized the last pages of a book are already contained in the first pages. That's expressing in a much more eloquent way than I was earlier this notion that whatever knowledge you try and obtain, it's informed by the method you chose to obtain that knowledge. So this idea that the last pages of a book are already contained in the first pages, it's in your head. It just hasn't come out yet. And to some extent, the last pages of a book are predetermined by what the first pages say. In other words, how you go about the conclusion depends on the approach you chose at the very start. But this is crucial. The climate make itself felt. Camus, and I'll be giving you specific examples now. Camus, I think what one of the massive strengths of art is, it expresses a climate of feeling, a climate of thought that is perhaps the best we can hope for. Will never explain away the absurdity of our confrontation with reality, according to Camus. But you can at least express the climate of feeling with art. So I'll give you an example. So this is David Caspar Friederich, who I quite regularly go to for examples. I think it's, forgive me if I've misremembered, but I think it's Monk by the Sea. And I just wanted to this idea, the climate make itself felt. So what I'm suggesting here is David Caspar Friederich and other artists, what they're able to do is express, for example here, the climate of loneliness, or the climate of, you know, the early definition of the absurd, the contrast between the intentions and the context within which you're trying to carry out those intentions that may be completely against you. And that type of notion of the absurd, I think this painting brilliantly expresses the futility of the individual against the power of nature, or the general indifference of existence, the puniness of the human being. You can obviously interpret it in lots of ways, but I don't think this particularly expresses how individual human beings are incredibly powerful and the world is weak. I think it's pretty clear it does the opposite. And this, I think this illustrates one of the previous quotes where Camus talking about the notion of a home, wanting to feel at home in the world. And I mentioned the Odyssey before. Obviously Ulysses is a Latinized form of Odysseus, but in the actual story, Ulysses or Odysseus is trapped on an island with basically nymphomaniac called Calypso, and he just wants to get home. Not tonight, dear, I have a headache. And Berkelin here he influenced, I've used Giorgio de Chirico several times in previous videos, and I'll be showing you one of his yet again shortly. But I think the influence of this, and then this was Giorgio de Chirico's brother, with just a sketch, and you can obviously see the shrouded figure looking off into the distance. And then you can see how that obviously influenced de Chirico. So I just think that why I'm showing you these paintings is to hopefully provide an illustration of what Camus was talking about when he said that, or he implied heavily, that what art can do is provide a sense of the climate. Rather than resigning ourselves to simple explanations, you can revolt against absurdity through engaging with it and being able to express the climate, what it feels like to be alive as a human being, even if sometimes they're not particularly happy emotions. So this just almost, it's almost palpable, the pensiveness of the shrouded figure. And then that's emphasized by the oracle on the right, which is about the unknowability of the future, the fact that you have to go to an oracle to try and find out what's going to happen. It's mysterious, it's unknown to mere mortals. And that, hence the title, The Enigma of the Oracle. So back to Camus, this idea of the drama of the absurd, because I want to give examples from Beckett. At this point of his effort, man stands face to face with the irrational. He feels within him his longing for happiness and for reason. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. The irrational, the human nostalgia, and the absurd that is born of their encounter. These are the three characters in the drama that must necessarily end with all the logic of which an existence is capable. So this just builds upon the previous idea of the confrontation that Camus was emphasizing, but he just becomes a bit more specific. So almost like the characters in this play of life are the irrational, the nostalgia, and the absurd. So the irrational is this unreasonable silence of the world. The world doesn't depend upon human rationale or human reason. The world is indifferent to us. And then nostalgia, the human nostalgia, is this desire to have an overarching story. And just sorry to bang on about it, but art's strength is it's self-conscious that it is only providing a story. Political ideology, fundamentalist science, they are not reflexive about their own limitations and how part of what they're telling is just a story. And for Camus, once again, the absurd is born out of this conflict, this confrontation in this drama between the irrational and the nostalgia for a unifying story. So he further develops this. When Karl Jasper's revealing the impossibility of constituting the world as a unity, like the scientists who want to explain everything, exclaims, "This limitation leads me to myself, where I can no longer withdraw behind an objective point of view that I am merely representing, where neither I myself nor the existence of others can any longer become an object for me. He is evoking after many others those waterless deserts where thought reaches its confines." So, I must have something deeply, deeply wrong with me, because I know this isn't cheery stuff, but I just get blown away by the language and the ability to describe what basically can't be described. So those waterless deserts where thought reaches its confines. So what Camus doing, referring to Karl Jaspers, is the idea that you can't constitute the world as a unity. You can't explain the whole world. So what you push back on is at least trying to understand yourself or engage with your own existence. So I can no longer withdraw behind an objective point of view that I'm merely representing, where neither I myself nor the existence of others can any longer become an object for me. So at some point you have to deal with your own subjectivity. And that's when he describes that like it's the limitations of thought. Thought often, you can have introspective thought, you can have often lots of human reason is faced outwards to the world to quantify it, to make sense of it. So again, as human beings, we're faced with this confrontation between our desire to externalize but our need for introspection. And I think that's what Camus is talking about here. the difficulty of reasoned introspection. It's almost a contradiction in terms. Those waterless deserts where thought reaches its confines. The real effort is to stay there, rather, insofar as it is possible. The real effort is to stay there, rather, insofar as that it is possible, and to examine closely the odd vegetation of those distant regions. Tenacity and acumen are privileged spectators of this inhuman show in which absurdity, hope, and death carry on their dialogue. Cheery stuff. The mind can then analyse the figures of that elementary yet subtle dance before illustrating them and relieving them itself. So I wanted to, why I've emphasised the odd vegetation of those distant regions. The phrase odd vegetation here is crucial to what I'm about to show you. And then this inhuman show in which absurdity, hope, and death carry on their dialogue. And we're back to this idea of illustrating, the concept of lighting up our human existence with illustrations and dreams and metaphors. This is all about the importance of art. But in particular, I just think these phrases, the odd vegetation and the inhuman show, are a great way of thinking about Samuel Beckett's work. So in the background there, you can see the odd vegetation, I'd suggest. And the whole of the plot, or lack of plot, of Waiting for Godot is about this playing out of the absurd condition that's just been described. The way in which Camus is describing the drama of absurdity. I can't think of a much more absurd drama than Waiting for Godot. And this is what I was saying before about me needing help. I don't know whether I said this before in another video, but I must have been 15, maybe. And it was in the days in the UK when there was so little on television. So I think at the time there might have only been 3 channels. There weren't even 4. And there was an afternoon showing of Waiting for Godot, and I didn't know what it was initially. And I was transfixed. It was almost like it was a weird aesthetic experience, because I was bored senseless to start with, just listlessly, flitting between the 3 channels. And then this play about the weird absurdity and boring nature of existence. And it had this weird epiphanic moment of just boredom squared with boredom created this weird feeling. And the play, I really, really enjoyed it. It was a BBC production. I think Ian McKellen might have been one of the actors. And I can't for the life of me remember the name of the... he used to play Rumpole of the Bailey. No, there have been various actors, and it was definitely Rumpole of the Bailey actor, but various people have obviously interpreted Waiting for Godot. And it was just, like I say, just a very odd experience. But all of these things that Camus is talking about, I'm suggesting, are contained in art like this. And then just to develop this idea, this is Alberto Giacometti, and he's the guy who designed the tree. And this is him meeting Beckett in his studio. And just in case you didn't believe me, there's your tree. Because Beckett gave very specific instructions for, I think there was only supposed to be 1 or 2 leaves. 1, 2, 3, not that I'm autistic or anything. Yeah, that you can say on each branch, I don't think there was allowed to be more than 1 leaf. almost to emphasize the spurness, the Spartan nature of the scene. And this is an example of Giacometti's his own sculpture work. And it may just be me, but I can hope you can get a sense of, the notion of the climate of the absurd. I can really see why Beckett and Giacometti wanted to work together. Because they're both in their very different ways trying to represent this climate of absurdity. For some reason, this is one of my absolute favourites. It's definitely not my silhouette, that's for sure. So again, Camus, like great works, deep feelings always mean more than they are conscious of saying. The regularity of an impulse or a repulsion in a soul is encountered again in habits of doing or thinking, is reproduced in consequences of which the soul itself knows nothing. Great feelings take with them their own universe, splendid or abject. They light up with their passion, an exclusive world in which they recognise their climate. We're back to this idea of climate. But I've emphasised here, Camus is making the direct comparison, like great works, deep feelings. He's saying art is matched with human feelings because both of them, they always mean more than they are conscious of saying. So it's why you can look at great art or go back to a Shakespeare play time after time after time, because there's always something more there. Great feelings take with them their own universe. But I also emphasize habits of doing or thinking, because habits is what Proust is about in La Recherche de Temps Perdu. It's about the confrontation, and Proust is a great example of what Camus is talking about. Because Proust describes habits of doing or thinking and how those habits get confronted with occasional feelings of involuntary memories or a sense of absurdity. And in fact, at the very end of La Recherche de Temps Perdu, he talks about there's an old guy sitting on a couch, and he doesn't think of him as that old, but then when he gets up, he has this sudden mental image of this old guy tottering about on giant stilts to represent how old he is and the time he's tottering over in his life. And it just reminded me of the Giacometti figures. But that might just be an overly subjective impression. But what I do know is that Beckett wrote an essay about Proust's notion of habit, which is something I will look at, even if none of you are interested in it. I will foist it upon you, because I think it's a brilliant essay. It was just called Proust, that Beckett wrote, but one of the main themes is this concept of habit. And the basic notion is habits, we use them to cover up. It's what helps get us through the day, so that we're not constantly thinking about the type of things I'm talking about now that might get us depressed, the whole absurdity of existence. There is a universe of jealousy, of ambition, of selfishness, or of generosity. A universe, in other words, a metaphysic and an attitude of mind. What is true of already specialized feelings will be even more so of emotions basically as indeterminate, simultaneously as vague and as definite, and as remote and as present as those furnished us by beauty or aroused by absurdity. So these notions of a universe, an attitude of mind, the previously discussed concept of a climate, emotions basically as indeterminate, simultaneously as vague and as definite, as remote and as present, as those furnished us by beauty or aroused by absurdity. If you can keep those words in mind, the next painting for me just sums up that paragraph. And I've shown this painting several times before, and when I've looked at Giorgio de Chirico's work. But for me, at least, I just think it represents so much of what some of the previous quotations have been referring to. So even the sense that it's got classical themes in it, but it's also got a modern clock, it's got a train in the background, so it's familiar, habitual things contrasted with this weird atmosphere of absurdity and anachronism, and just the deep mystery, the enigmatic nature of the shadow on the right and the recesses of the arcades and the depths of the pool. He's got it all going on. The green ambiguity of the sky. But I fear I could witter on, because de Chirico is... I could just never tire of looking at his stuff. So back to absurdity. It symbolises that odd state of soul in which the void becomes eloquent, in which the chain of daily gestures is broken. That's what I was referring to with Proust. In which the heart vainly seeks the link that will connect it again. Then it is as it were the first sign of absurdity. It's a brilliant phrase, the void becomes eloquent. I think that's what great art does, and that de Chirico, I think that makes the void eloquent. Like, nobody makes shadows speak like de Chirico. It happens that the stage sets collapse. Rising, streetcar, 4 hours in the office of the factory, meal, streetcar, 4 hours of work, meal, sleep, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday according to the same rhythm. This path is easily followed most of the time. But one day, the why arises, and everything begins in that weariness tinged with amazement. Again, just a great way of putting it, and again, very relevant to Proust. Strangeness creeps in, perceiving that the world is dense, sensing to what degree a stone is foreign and irreducible to us, with what intensity nature or a landscape can negate us. At the heart of all beauty lies something inhuman, and these hills, the softness of the sky, the outline of these trees at this very minute, lose the illusory meaning with which he had clothed them, henceforth more remote than a lost paradise. And I'd encourage you, if you haven't already seen it, to go back to I'll include it in the description, but the video I did on Van Gogh's tree roots. And I compared them with, or accompanied them with, an excerpt from Sartre's La Nausée, where Roquetin, the protagonist in the novel La Nausée, is looking at the tree roots of a chestnut tree. And I'd suggest both Sartre and Van Gogh are talking about this density of reality, that in absurd moments just hits us. The primitive hostility of the world rises up to face us across millennia. For a second we cease to understand it, because for centuries we have understood it in solely the images and designs that we had attributed to it beforehand, because henceforth we lack the power to make use of that artifice. The world evades us because it becomes itself again. That stage scenery, masked by habit, becomes again what it is. It withdraws at a distance from us. And I'd suggest that's what Beckett does. That stage, because Camus uses this notion of stage sets quite a lot. He's already used it in a previous quotation. But that stage scenery masked by habit, I think the stage scenery Beckett uses is the opposite. He makes us, as with the tree, the burness of the tree, Giacometti's tree. He stops things being masked by habit. So on the tree theme, if I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, this life would have a meaning. Or rather, this problem would not arise, for I should belong to this world. I should be this world to which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence upon familiarity. This ridiculous reason is what sets me in opposition to all creation, and what constitutes the basis of that conflict, of that break between the world and my mind. But the awareness of it, if therefore I want to preserve it, I can through a constant awareness, ever revived, ever alert. So this is the paradox of what it is to be human. If you're a tree among trees or a cat among animals, there isn't any reflexive question about your purpose on earth. It's a uniquely human, self-reflexive feature. And Camus saying, if I want to preserve it, I can through a constant awareness. So rather than move away from our human nature of ever-ending, never-ending reflexivity, you lean into it through this constant awareness, which again I'd suggest is much more likely if you've got art as a help, rather than falling into this insistence upon familiarity. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is, above all, contemplating it. And this is crucial, because I'm going to start showing you a pile of images based on this. Unlike Eurydice, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. One of the only coherent philosophical positions is thus revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity. It is an insistence upon an impossible transparency. It challenges the world anew every second. Just as danger provided man the unique opportunity of seizing awareness, so metaphysical revolt extends awareness to the whole of experience. It is that constant presence of man in his own eyes. It is not an aspiration, for it is devoid of hope. That revolt is the certainty of a crushing fate without the resignation that ought to accompany it. So Eurydice refers to Orpheus. Orpheus marries Eurydice. Very shortly after their marriage, she's bitten by a snake and dies. And Orpheus, famous for playing music, goes down to the underworld. I'll be quoting from Ovid later on. But he goes down to the underworld to persuade the gods to let him have Eurydice back. And they agree, but he's not allowed to look at her until he leaves Hades. And it's quite poignant because he can't, she's touching him from behind him, well, at least one of the variants. But because he can't feel her, because he's in the underworld, he turns round to see whether she's still there. And that's when she turns to stone and he can't leave with her. Insistence upon an impossible transparency. Again, that's what art tries to do. And in Worsted Hoe, Beckett has that famous quote, fail, try again, fail better, and variants upon that notion. But this is art's glorious failure, is it tries to give transparency to our existence. It's never going to succeed, but at least it gives a hint of it and is aware of its own inevitable failure. And just to give you, so this concept of Eurydice, unlike Eurydice, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. So the corollary of that is, according to Camus, we need to turn into art rather than turning away. So unlike Eurydice, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. He's asking us, Camus is asking us to confront absurdity head on. And I'm going to show you now a load of Rodin sculptures, which I believe he does exactly this. He doesn't turn away from the absurd, he turns into it. The 1887 is when it was modelled and carved. So in quite a few of these sculptures, you'll see two different dates. I just think it's stunning the way he gets the figures, the marble, the figures to come out from the marble. And this is art's glorious failure, because especially sculpture, it's limited by its immobility. But Rodin has managed to make the immobility, the lack of movement, express itself weirdly, much more powerfully than movement could, if that makes any sense. It's simultaneously static and there's a sense of movement, because Eurydice looks like she's coming out from the stone, or more in accordance with the myth, she's being dragged back because he can't take her out Hades. But if ever absurdity was made to look beautiful, this would be my argument, you know, drawing upon Camus. And this was, these were the various castings of this done by Rodin around the world. But the idea was they were for the gates of hell, was the idea. Fueled by Dante's, you remember in the Inferno, abandon all hope ye who enter here. And you can see at the top of the center, towards the top, you can see the Thinker, a small version of the Thinker, Rodin's most famous sculpture. And then I'm going to show you some of the following sculptures were originally intended to go on this, and for various reasons he chose not to. So, you know, a depiction of the power of age. I'm assuming the old courtesan in her time was a beauty, but no longer, I'm afraid. And I find this, amidst all the depressing notions of absurdity and human existence, this always makes me giggle once you see the title. Because I have a phobia about teenagers. They're the most mardy, miserable, high maintenance. Apologies to anyone who's got teenage children. I've never been able to stand them. And this just reminds me of, you know, a teenager, you've forgotten to buy them their favourite cereal in the morning or something. And the complete pathological overreaction. Mum. But some of his statues are in marble, some are in stone, some are in bronze, as in this one. Just the amazing ability to get figures to come out of marble. And again, the way he uses the limitation of using marble, but to give the impression of an object coming out of something that is fundamentally inert. So he uses the limitation of the art form in order to create the art. And I think the following is my absolute favourite, not to bias you at all. Because the Danaides were daughters or granddaughters of a king that gets mentioned in Ovid, and I think 50 of them got married. I think they're their cousins, but anyway, 50 got married to their father's brother's sons, I think, and all but one of them, they had an arrangement where they all killed their husbands on the wedding night, and their fate was to be sent down to Hades, and they had to, it's relevant to Sisyphus because it's the pointlessness of it all. They had to carry water in ewers or vases that had holes in, so it was completely pointless exercise, and they had to do that for all eternity. And this particular statue implies that one of the Danaids has just given up and has sunk into the ground in frustration almost. But I just think absolutely stunning. You know, in the previous quotation about the absurdity sometimes the rock might strike you with, this is the notion of leaning in. So rather than just, you know, kick a rock around or look at a rock as just this inert indifference of the world to human concerns, Rodin takes a lump of stone and does this with it. I'm amazed this hasn't been used for something tacky like a Head and Shoulders advert. It will be one day, I'm sure. So this is from the Metamorphoses from Ovid. And with his words, the music made and this is talking about Orpheus when I said he's gone down to the underworld. And with his words, the music made the pale phantoms weep. Ixion's wheel was still. Tityos's vultures left the liver. Tantalus tried no more to reach for the water. And Belus's daughters rested from their urns, and Sisyphus climbed on his rock to listen. I love that phrase, and Sisyphus climbed on his rock to listen. And I just think that's an absolutely amazing epigraph for the power of art. Even Sisyphus, condemned to an eternity to push a rock up a hill, even Sisyphus, when Orpheus plays his music, even he climbed on his rock and stopped to listen. So now I'm just going to quickly show you illustrations of the various people mentioned, so starting with Ixion. And I won't go into the full details of why they all got sent down to hell, but the idea was he would be on a fiery wheel for eternity. So the French title there is Ixion Falls into Hell. And then the following is Michelangelo. So the idea is he's having his liver pecked out by vultures every day. And this is where, not that I'm pedantic, moi, but the idea is his liver's being pecked out. But Jose should have realised the liver is on the right-hand side, not the left. So 10 out of 10 for artistic ability, but 2 out of 10 for biological knowledge, Jose. And then the idea with Tantalus was he was tempted by an apple that was permanently just above his head. And then every time he leant down to drink some water, the water disappeared. And that was what he'd be, hence the word tantalized. They really know how to stick it to people, the old Greek gods, don't they? Go on, just a little bite. Then they have the Danaïdes with their pointless emptying of the water. So the Danaid on the bottom who's leaning down, obviously the similarities there to the Rodin sculpture. And John William Waterhouse here, he was the guy who did the Echo and Narcissus at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool that I've shown before. It's the same artist. So this is this is separated by quite a distance in the actual the tales, Ovid's tales. But much later on, and Orpheus's ghost fled under the earth and knew the places he had known before, and haunting the fields of the blessed found Eurydice and took her in his arms. And now together and side by side they wander, or Orpheus follows or goes ahead, and may with perfect safety look back for his Eurydice. So it's quite a Hollywood Disney ending in terms of the myths. Orpheus, when he dies, finally gets back and he doesn't have to panic. It's quite funny, they almost play at leaving one going ahead because now there isn't any danger of him losing her. And then this is subjective. It's this notion of looking back. So rather than looking away, which is what Orpheus was supposed to do, Camus' idea that you don't look away from absurdity, you look back into it. Just subjectively, this painting always reminds me of that, looking back into Hades. But that's the point and power of art. And interestingly, this is by Giacometti. So just to round things up, That revolt gives life its value. Spread out over the whole length of a life, it restores its majesty to that life. To a man devoid of blinkers, there is no finer sight than that of the intelligence at grips with a reality that transcends it. The sight of human pride is unequalled. No disparagement is of any use. That discipline that the mind imposes on itself, that will conjured up out of nothing, that face-to-face struggle have something exceptional about them. To impoverish that reality, whose inhumanity constitutes man's majesty, is tantamount to impoverishing him himself. I understand then why the doctrines that explain everything to me also debilitate me at the same time. They relieve me of the weight of my own life, and yet I must carry it alone. So I just think that's quite a nice summary of a lot of the ideas I've been taking out from Camus. This idea of leaning into, facing the absurdity, not relying upon the doctrines that explain everything to me, because they also debilitate you. Be at peace with not knowing. There is no finer sight than that of the intelligence at grips with a reality that transcends it. Which, again, I just think that's what all great artists do. They're battling against a reality that is cruelly indifferent to them, but still they go on. Fail, try again, fail better. But anyway, I'll just finish now with this couple of illustrations of they relieve me of the weight of my own life, and yet I must carry it alone. So some images of Sisyphus to finish round off. We started with Sisyphus, let's end with him on the complete go up the hill, back down the hill, go up the hill type of idea. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed that. Till the next time, all the very best. Goodbye.